How's it going, everyone? This is Kevin. Today I'll bring along with me to show you the difference between APS-C cameras to full frame to see which one would be the best investment for you. So let's jump right into it. One of the questions that I probably get asked relatively often is, what camera should I get? Should it be full frame or APS-C? So today I wanted to do a little bit of a test between my Sony a7 IV and my Fujifilm camera that's an XS10 to see if the APS-C or full frame camera is better for your content creation needs. So we're gonna cover the image quality, the price point for what you're getting out of the camera, as well as the usability when it comes down to the form factor of each camera. Because at the end of the day, it's always going to be what checks off the list when it comes down to what you want for a camera, but that way you can see a little bit of examples of both, what I think about the price point to ratio of quality, as well as the form factor of each of camera to see, well, if it's better to have a lighter camera setup like an APS-C or a more full frame body that's a little bit larger, but covers more bases. So to keep it as close together as possible, I'm gonna shoot at the same focal length and also f-stop and everything, just to make sure that it's the same quality all around, to basically compare both of them to see if you can tell a major difference. Is it more obvious to know which one the APS-C camera might be versus the full frame, and maybe see a little bit difference of the image of quality to help your case today. So for the Fuji XS10, we're going to be using the 27mm f2.8, which is an equivalent about 40mm. So with my Sony a7 IV, we're going to be using the Tamron 20-40, shooting it at 40 since it's an f2.8, and I think because of the light kind of setup with it as well, it makes more sense to kind of showcase a little bit side to side how each would perform, as well with the build of it. Now we're gonna do the other one just to kind of make sure we get the same ones, and I'll show you the results side by side before telling you which one is which. So now, could you tell a major difference in image quality when it came down to the APS-C versus the full frame, or was it hard to tell whenever it came down to seeing the side-by-side and taking your wild guess? Spoiler, I know that with the compression of YouTube, it's a little bit harder to tell, but you're still able to see the majority of the image, to see how the blur background is, the bokeh, the compression, everything like that. So that's my ultimate take when it comes down to this kind of comparison of quality test. Mainly because a lot of people tend to worry about if you get better bokeh with the full frame, how much more dynamic range might you get, so on and so forth. So this is the ultimate, comparison, just to see if it's major notice for you, because maybe APS-C isn't that much of a notice from the full frame for you, and you can save some money, which in a bit, we'll talk more about the pricing, but we're gonna go ahead and get another comparison quick. So now we're going to take a couple more photos here in this little bridge section just to compare it a little bit further and go from there. So once again, were you correct in your guess when it came down to the comparison, or were you maybe fooled by them? I don't know yet. I know you get to see them first before me, so this is why I'm having to ask you, and to see how you're doing with the testing of it, of the quality of the image. One thing when it comes down to with the APS-C mode versus the full frame, obviously remember that if you have a millimeter equivalent of, let's say in the APS-C, like the 27, how I'm doing, it's going to be about a 40mm full frame, probably more like a 41, so I'm trying to match as much as possible. But just so you know, whenever you go into that APS-C line, if you decide to invest into the lenses, that's something to keep in mind to see what equivalent they would be into the full frame mode, because it's a big difference. Sometimes it's like a 1.5 equivalence or a 1.6 depending on the camera brand. So now let's talk about the pricing of the APS-C versus a full frame camera. You're gonna notice that most APS-C cameras and lenses are cheaper than full frame because of, well, the size of them. The image sensor is a lot bigger on a full frame. It's a 35mm versus the APS-C. It's just a lot smaller. So with that being said, you're gonna have a little bit more dynamic range, well, in theory, into the full frame cameras rather than an APS-C mode. So that's something to consider, that it's going to be a little bit pricier to get better glass for the full frame as well as the bodies compared to the APS-C line. See, when it comes down to my Fujifilm, like the XS10, it's a very great camera. It has really good for photos and minor video. It's not really meant for a crazy, basically camera like how my Sony a7 IV is, but it's good to compare with the photography side of it because most people tend to shoot photos rather than video when it comes down to watching this kind of videos. At least it seems like it with the questions that I get. So with that being in mind, an average good camera that it's an APS-C line, like for example the Fuji X-T5, can range around sometimes around $1,500 to $1,700 depending if you buy it new or used, and depending on the demand right now, because apparently like a Fuji X100V right now, it's kind of ridiculous to get because they're being resold for over $2,000 when it was like $1,500 new. So yeah, with that being said, most cameras when it comes down to the APS-C line are in the mid thousands kind of range to a little bit lower. Some of them can be in the higher range depending how good the video specs are. But when it comes down to like the Sony a7 IV, it's a camera that starts about $2,500. You get the Lumix X5 II, that's $2,200, and they're in the full frame range, so they're gonna be a little bit more expensive. Sony even has their APS-C line of cameras. I'm not the biggest fan of them because I just never really liked them whenever I used to shoot APS-C. I felt like it was just not for me, I guess, so that's why I went to the full frame lineup. So with that being said, it's just, you just have to look at what checks your list more. With the APS-C line of cameras, on average, lenses can be a couple $100, maybe closer to the $1,000 range, unless you get to the really premium lenses. When it comes down to the full frame lineup, you have more lenses there in the thousands of dollars range to the upper the $2,000 ranges, because it's just more glass. It's, you know, heavier, better system, if you will, to be able to create content with, because it's just what most professionals that I've seen use. I'm not saying you can't use APS-C cameras for professional content. I'm just saying most professionals that I know tend to shoot full frame for a certain reason. So once again, the pricing when it comes down to APS-C versus full frame, it is going to be a lot cheaper to get APS-C line of bodies and lenses versus full frame. So you have to decide, what are you looking for when it comes down to a camera? Are you looking for something that has maybe the 4K 120 line like the Sony a7S III, or even some Fujifilms like I think it's like the 2H or X2H. They tend to have like 8K 30 frames per second, 4K 120 and all that stuff, but then you start seeing the difference in price points, so it ultimately comes down to you. But on average dollar to cost ratio, you have more budget-friendly APS-C line lenses and bodies versus full frame. And now we're going to talk about the form factor of the camera bodies to showcase the difference of what they all bring to each other, to see if the size of the camera matters to you. So for example, when it comes down to the quality, build, and size of the bodies, this is the APS-C versus my full frame. If you can tell, right there and then, it's a major difference when it comes down to this size of the body versus this one, as well as the lens. This is a 40mm equivalent versus a zoom lens, obviously, from 20 to 40, and you can tell the difference on the sizes when it comes down to the body to the lens as well between each other. This is my other zoom lens that it comes for a, very large zoom lens when it comes down to the 35 to 150. Has a really good range because of an f2 to 2.8. Really great glass. The pricing on this one's like $18.99 when you get it new. So it's a little bit, hefty when it comes down to the price point, versus a zoom lens from my Fuji. This is an 18 to 55. Equivalent is like a 24 to 75, give or take. So look at the difference when it comes down to the sizes. It's a major difference when it comes down to a full frame versus APS-C. That's what you have to ultimately decide for yourself, is the APS-C lineup going to be good bang for my buck with the quality for this size versus this one for the full frame. You start comparing the prices to the quality, and you have to decide for yourself which one would be best for you. So for example, when it comes down to traveling and the sizes of things, here is what it looks like with my Fuji and where it takes up how much of my camera bag, versus my Sony takes up a lot more space because it just takes a lot more into the camera, because the lenses, the bodies, and everything are a lot bigger. So that's something to consider when it comes down to the traveling and the sizing of everything. if you want to do more street photography, travel photography, if you want to be a little bit more less, seen or not, it's up to you. So knowing those factors tend to decide what makes sense when it comes down to the APS-C versus full frame. So now I'll give you my final thoughts when it comes down to the comparison of APS-C versus full frame and why I went with both, but in reality I use more full frame. See, for me, full frame just made more sense when it comes down to my photo and video taking, because it just worked better for my budget, for what I wanted, and for long-term purposes where I would have to invest into a body that would last me for years to come, rather to maybe have something that would be good for a moment and then have to be upgrading because maybe my demand or my skills needed something different. So I chose to start with APS-C first, though, with a Sony a6000, and then I started going with my Sony a7 III. The reason why I went to the full frame versus keeping it with the APS-C mode, I just like the better quality of the filming for like the Sony a7 III versus the a6400 or the 6300. It just didn't make sense for me to kind of stay in that line, and I felt that it was good enough for me to start upgrading into that full frame because I just liked the way it worked for my style and for my skill level and for my investment. And don't get me wrong, my Sony a7 III now to my Sony a7 IV and a7S III has been a great investment, but now with a lot of the Fujifilm cameras, their APS-C mode, and even some of the new Canon, their APS-C, you have a lot of good cameras that have really great specs for the bang for your buck, as well as are great for photography and videography with good lenses, and you're able to do a lot more with it now. So seeing that today, I might consider like to go into maybe in the Fuji line for me rather than Canon, just because I like the Fuji line with the video specs that you can get, as well with the photography and the Fujifilm recipes. So that's something that I would consider if you're wanting to have a good camera that just has really great JPEGs if you want to do recipes, if you don't want to edit too much, versus having to edit every single time, since the Sony line cameras don't really have really great profiles for like straight out JPEGs. And that's the reason why for me, I invested into the full frame lineup. It just worked better for what I wanted out of my cameras. I really fell in love with the third-party lenses with the Tamron ones. I've been shooting only Tamron lenses. I've had a Sony lines before, which weren't the G Masters, but they were still good enough. And now I'm good with my Tamron lenses. I have my 20 to 40 millimeter and my 35 to 150. I still have my 17 to 28 just because I haven't gotten rid of it yet, but I'm pretty much trying to sell it now just because I know I'm going to keep the 20 to 40 for sure. I do like the 17 range that I'm filming with right now, but like I said, these lenses were most of them under 1,000, my 20 to 40, and my 35 to 150 was under 2,000, and it covers everything I need to have great quality and have just great outcomes for whatever I invested into my lineup of gear. But that's all that I have for when it comes down to the comparison between the APS-C versus full frame, when it comes down to the quality of the image, the pricing, and also the quality of the build of the cameras and lenses that could work out for you when it comes down to your content creation needs. But with all that said and done, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, share this video with a friend. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.